You've heard of kings who fell in battle, but you rarely hear of the ones who died slowly, in silence, not from swords, but from their own skin in the Middle Ages. There was one disease so feared that even the most powerful rulers trembled at the first itch or blemish. It toppled dynasties without a single rebellion, and rewrote laws more effectively than any war tonight. You're not just going to hear about battles and thrones. You're going to discover how disease, not armies, truly ruled the medieval world. So lie back, get comfortable, and let me tell you the story of the illness that terrified kings more than death itself. The Royal Plague. How leprosy haunted the thrones of medieval Europe. Chapter 1. The disease that stole crowns. If you had been a king in medieval Europe, there were many dangers you might have expected to face. Rival claimants to your throne, ambitious barons who commanded too many men, or perhaps a foreign invader eager to test the strength of your kingdom's defenses. But there was another, quieter enemy, one that no knight's sword could block and no castle wall could keep away. This enemy was disease, and among all the afflictions that haunted the Middle Ages, there was one in particular that seemed to gnaw at the minds of rulers more than most: leprosy. Leprosy, today known more precisely as Hansen's disease, was a chronic bacterial infection. In the medieval imagination, however, it was much more than that. It was a condition that blurred the line between the medical and the spiritual, between punishment and misfortune. It marked the body in ways that could not be hidden: skin lesions, deformities, the gradual wasting of hands and feet, and the slow collapse of the face into a mask of disfigurement. For kings whose power depended so much on their appearance, on the spectacle of health and majesty, this disease carried not only the threat of suffering, but of political ruin. By the 11th and 12th centuries, leprosy was spreading across Europe with enough force to transform landscapes and institutions. The disease was feared so much that leprosaria, or leper hospitals, dotted the countryside. Kings often granted land and privileges to such institutions, both out of charity and out of fear that they, too, might one day be forced to live in such a place. You might imagine that leprosy was only a disease of peasants and the poor, but the truth was more complicated. In medieval thought, illness did not discriminate between classes. If a king fell ill, his suffering could be read as divine punishment, a sign that even the most powerful mortal could be humbled by God. And there were indeed kings who either suffered from leprosy or were believed by their subjects to carry its marks. One of the most famous examples was Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, often called the Leper King. Baldwin was crowned in 1174, in a city already trembling under the shadow of Muslim powers to the east. He was a boy of only 13 years when he took the throne, and he was already showing signs of leprosy. Chronicles describe how his hands and face began to show the unmistakable signs of the disease. Yet he continued to lead his kingdom through some of the most turbulent decades of the Crusader states. Baldwin's story became one of endurance, but also of tragedy. His illness weakened his kingdom, not only because it consumed his health, but because it destabilized the line of succession, leaving Jerusalem vulnerable. For his contemporaries, Baldwin was living proof of what they feared most: that leprosy could bring even a king to his knees. The fear of leprosy among rulers was not confined to the Holy Land. In France, England, and the German principalities, kings were acutely aware that the disease carried not only a medical burden, but also a symbolic one. To be seen as visibly disfigured, as blemished, was to risk whispers that you were unfit to rule. Medieval kingship was deeply tied to the idea of divine approval. If your body failed in such a public and terrifying way, it was easy for your subjects to believe that God himself had withdrawn his favor. The rituals of monarchy reflected this fear. When a king was crowned, he was anointed with holy oil, set apart as a chosen ruler. But what happened when a chosen ruler began to show the marks of a disease that many believed was sent by God as punishment for sin? Would his anointing still count? Would his laws still carry weight? For many medieval kings, the dread of leprosy was the dread of losing legitimacy itself. Medical knowledge of the time only heightened the anxiety. Physicians did not understand the true cause of leprosy. Instead, they offered theories drawn from ancient texts. Some believed it was caused by an imbalance of the humors, particularly black bile, which poisoned the body over time. Others thought it was spread through corrupted air or through the touch of a leper. Because it was poorly understood, the disease became shrouded in superstition. A king might fear that any sudden rash or swelling was the first step toward the dreadful condition. This fear was reflected in law codes and policies. Kings frequently issued charters that regulated the treatment of lepers, creating separate spaces for them outside towns. These leprosaria were both hospitals and places of exile, where those diagnosed with the disease were expected to live apart. In some regions, lepers were even given symbolic funerals, as if they had died to the community. For a king, the idea of being forced into such isolation was chilling. The ruler of a realm treated as if he were already dead. But it was not only physical decline or social exile that terrified kings. It was the way leprosy ate away at the very image of rulership. Consider how much medieval kings relied on appearances, on processions, on grand feasts, on standing before their subjects as figures of majesty. Their very bodies were part of the performance of power. When a king was carried through the streets, or when he raised his sword in a ceremony, his people saw not only the man but the embodiment of order and stability. What would happen if that body was no longer whole, if the skin broke and the hands withered? Could majesty survive a body that looked like it had been cursed? For Baldwin IV, the answer was complex. Despite his illness, he fought in battles, negotiated treaties, and even achieved victories. Chroniclers admired his courage, but they also saw his suffering as both a warning and a symbol. He was known as the Leper King, and while the title carried respect, it also underscored the uncomfortable truth. His reign was inseparable from his disease. He could not escape it, and neither could his kingdom elsewhere in Europe. Kings watched Baldwin's story unfold with unease. It was a reminder that disease did not stop at borders or palaces. It could take hold in the highest courts, threatening dynasties. Some monarchs began to present themselves as healers of leprosy, using the ritual of the royal touch. This ceremony was most famously practiced in France and England, where kings claimed that by laying their hands on sufferers, they could heal scrofula, another disfiguring disease sometimes confused with leprosy. The practice reinforced the idea that kings were divinely chosen. But beneath the surface, it was also a defense against fear, a way of saying, if I can heal, then surely I cannot be the one afflicted, and yet, the fear never disappeared. Behind the pomp and ceremony, behind the rituals of healing and anointing, lay the quiet dread that the crown itself could not protect the body from decay. A scratch, a blemish, a numb finger, all could be read as the first whisper of the disease that kings feared most. As the Middle Ages wore on, the presence of leper hospitals became a constant reminder. They stood outside the walls of towns and cities, places of charity but also of warning. Kings might pass them on their travels, granting them privileges or endowments. Each act of charity was also a confrontation with possibility. Perhaps, one day, the king himself might be forced to enter. It is difficult now to fully understand the weight of that fear. Today, leprosy is a treatable condition, managed with antibiotics. But for a medieval king, it was a specter that haunted his reign. It was a disease that could undo the work of armies and councils. Not by striking the realm directly, but by striking the king himself. And so the question lingered, what was worse for a king to lose his throne through rebellion, or to lose it through the slow creeping disfigurement of disease? Chapter 2. Crown and Contagion. How Kings Turned Illness into Law. You must imagine once more, the medieval king seated not in glittering halls, but in ledgers. legal parchments, and uneasy silence. Disease, in his mind, had already ceased to be a mere illness. It had become a political factor, a diplomatic threat, and most importantly, a test of royal authority. While leprosy terrified the common man, it embarrassed the king, for it was one of the few forces he could not bribe, conquer, or imprison. Rulers across Europe gradually discovered that they could not kill disease, but they could organize it. And so began one of the earliest forms of public health legislation. Not out of compassion, but out of fear disguised as order. The monarchy first approached leprosy as it approached many problems, by writing it into law. In England, under Henry II and later Edward I, edicts declared that no person smitten with the foul disease should enter markets, churches, or fairs. Those who ignored the restrictions could be fined, imprisoned, or in rare cases, whipped for endangering the peace of the realm. In France, King Philip IV issued similar commands. Though with a difference, French law frequently referred to lepers not as criminals, but as wards of the king. That phrasing mattered. It implied that they were both excluded and owned. Lepers were often placed under direct royal jurisdiction, separate from local lords. This strange combination of protection and exclusion allowed monarchs to appear merciful while consolidating legal power. A leper no longer belonged to his town, his guild, or even his family. He belonged officially to the crown to enforce these laws. Monarchs turned to their usual instruments: clerks, sheriffs, bishops, and bailiffs. But leprosy required a unique bureaucratic device, the leper's badge. It was not a uniform across Europe, but most kingdoms required that an afflicted person carry or wear something unmistakable. In England, it was often a bell or wooden clapper, used to announce one's presence before approaching a crossroads or water well. In Germany, some cities demanded a distinctive cloak or hat, colored gray or blue. In French territories, the badge could be a strip of cloth sewn onto the shoulder. Not unlike later centuries' symbols of forced identity, these were not merely health measures. They were social scripts, designed to train the population in the recognition of legal uncleanliness. Medieval kings did not invent quarantine, but they perfected public obedience to it. At the same time, monarchs discovered that outcasting an entire class of people created logistical issues. Where would the diseased go? Who would feed them? What if they roamed in hunger and took to banditry? And so kings embraced another institution, the leper house, also called the lazar house or lazaret. These facilities were rarely hospitals in the modern sense. Most were small rural settlements, often located outside city walls, usually near a stream or chapel. A king did not necessarily fund them directly. Instead, he would grant land, or more commonly, grant a charter, allowing an abbot or local guild to operate it with tax exemptions. The crown thus ensured both containment and stability, without depleting its own treasury. But not all lazar houses were alike. In England alone, there were more than 300 recorded institutions for lepers by the 13th century. Some were little more than huts. Others, such as the famous St. Giles Hospital in London, became near autonomous communities with their own chapel, fields, and elected officers. And because these houses were technically outside ordinary law, kings often used them for secondary purposes. For instance, a suspected traitor too politically dangerous to execute might be quietly declared a leper and sent into seclusion. A widowed noblewoman with claims to property might be encouraged, under subtle pressure, to retire into religious quarantine. Some, children born with visible defects, were also sent into lazar houses even when not diseased, to prevent future inheritance disputes. Thus, leprosy, or rather, the accusation of it, became a legal instrument. In this way, leprosy functioned not only as a medical diagnosis, but as a social verdict. At times, these laws produced strange paradoxes. Lepers were forbidden from most public gatherings. Yet some kingdoms allowed them to form processions during Holy Week. In France, they walked through the streets collecting alms, accompanied by royal guards, not for protection, but to ensure they returned to their settlements afterward. In Spain, some records suggest that lepers were permitted to vote in local council matters, provided they voted as a separate bloc. Kings also discovered that public hatred of disease could be redirected. At moments of political unrest, rumors circulated that lepers were poisoning wells or secretly in league with foreign enemies. On at least 2 recorded occasions, one in 1321, France, and another in 1413, Castile monarchs allowed such rumors to spread strategically, using disease panic to distract the population from tax revolts, but it could backfire. Philip V of France attempted to execute dozens of lepers accused of espionage, only to face backlash from bishops who accused him of violating Christian charity. The Church, after all, claimed leprosy as its theological property. Christ had healed lepers in Scripture. To mistreat them was to challenge divine precedent, and so began one of the quietest battles in medieval governance: the struggle between throne and altar over who ruled the diseased. Kings passed laws. Bishops wrote sermons. Monasteries declared lazar houses to be holy spaces, while sheriffs declared them controlled zones. Lepers themselves occasionally resisted, filing petitions declaring that they were loyal subjects of the king who deserved better rations or safer living quarters. Some even argued in court that expulsion from the town violated ancient charters of freedom. If you imagine lepers as silent outcasts, history gently corrects you. They were powerless in body, yet loud in law. Their status was endlessly debated: sinners or saints, citizens or exiles, cursed or protected. Kings, ever practical, often responded with calculated ambiguity. They issued laws that separated lepers, but followed them with charters that granted rights. They punished public gatherings of the diseased, but permitted controlled festivals. They forbade them from inheriting land, then allowed exceptions for loyalty or noble birth. This inconsistency was not incompetence. It was strategy. To define disease too clearly was to risk setting permanent rules. Better, perhaps, to keep the afflicted in limbo, forever dependent on the king's mercy. And so law became not a boundary, but a gate, one that opened or closed at the discretion of power. But one question lingered over royal courts. What if a king himself showed signs of the disease? Could the law be turned upon its maker? Would a monarch, bound by his own proclamations, be forced to exile himself from his own throne? And if not, how would he convince his people that the law, designed to separate the sick, did not apply to the one who wrote it? Chapter 3. The Crown Under Siege. When disease stepped inside the throne room, you must imagine once more the flickering torchlight of a medieval corridor, not in a monastery or village leper house, but within the walls of a royal palace. Disease had long been treated as something external, something to be fenced out with laws and badges in exile. But kings, like all men, were made of flesh. And flesh was treacherous. Every monarch, no matter how mighty, lived with a persistent, unspoken question. What if the illness entered the throne room? What if the signs, the first pale patch of numbness, the tingling in the fingers, appeared not on a beggar, but on a king? The silent medical panic of kings, royal physicians, for all their confidence in public, were privately powerless against leprosy. They could prescribe poultices of vinegar, whale fat, or ground fern leaves, or recommend soaks in warm wine infused with herbs, but none of these halted the disease. At best, they disguised symptoms, allowing rulers to delay suspicion. Some kings took daily ritual baths, believing heat could drive out cold humors. Others slept in linen steeped in rose oil, hoping that pleasant scent might indicate inner purity. A few, desperate or devout, engaged in bloodletting, cutting themselves intentionally to release corruption. And yet, all knew such methods were little more than hopeful superstition. A medieval monarch's greatest fear was not death by sword, but slow decay witnessed by a court of rivals. Unlike battle wounds, which earned honor, leprosy signaled divine rejection. A king could not rally armies if his own body whispered of God's disfavor. Rumored royal lepers, history, ever cautious, rarely confirmed royal infections. Chroniclers avoided writing plainly what might be considered blasphemy or treasonous gossip. Yet traces survived in whispers and absences. King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem was the only medieval monarch openly acknowledged as a leper. He ruled through strength of will, commanding armies from horseback even as his fingers lost grip on the reins. His commanders tied reins to his wrist with cloth so that he might ride still as king. But even Baldwin, revered as the leper king, had to accept the inevitable. He could not marry, could not produce heirs, could not rule long. King Henry IV of Germany was rumored to have shown blemishes upon his arms and face, leading some to label him cursed. His enemies claimed he stank of rot, though this may have been political exaggeration. Still, the rumor was weapon enough. Louis IX of France, later St. Louis, was so terrified of leprosy that he reportedly kissed afflicted beggars deliberately, believing that true faith would render him immune. Whether this was sincere piety or desperate testing of divine favor, none could say. In England, some whispered that King John, accused of tyranny, died not of poison but of inward decay. His body was buried quickly, with scant ceremony, a sign perhaps of discomfort with its state, even when a king did not have leprosy. The accusation alone could weaken him. It could delegitimize a reign without rebellion or war. Just a single rumor, have you heard? The king's skin has changed, could turn loyal subjects cautious. Thus, monarchs adopted one more survival tactic: strategic visibility, to prove their health. Kings appeared constantly in public, even when ill. They rode in parades, gripped swords firmly, and shook hands when perhaps their hands trembled. They staged royal touch ceremonies, laying hands on the sick to prove they were not diseased themselves. The ritual of royal touch across France and England. Monarchs developed a peculiar practice. They claimed to cure disease by touch. Specifically, they targeted scrofula, a form of tuberculosis that caused swollen glands. It was not leprosy, but close enough in public imagination that the ritual served as a declaration: if I can heal illness, I cannot carry it. Crowds gathered as the king passed his hand over swelling or laid coins around necks. The gold coin, known as the touch piece, became a talisman. Even if the patient did not recover, the ritual still succeeded in elevating the king as one chosen by God. The ceremony was less about healing others than healing reputation. When law met flesh, there was, however, one grave legal question: what if a king truly fell ill? Could a monarch be stripped of rule due to disease? The church insisted that no man could be barred from salvation due to illness. Kings used this argument: if leprosy did not bar one from heaven, why should it bar one from ruling? But nobles disagreed. They argued that incapacity to appear in court or command armies rendered a king unfit. Thus, the legal debate became not, is he cursed? But rather, is he functional? And so, monarchs clung to functionality desperately. Some held councils from behind veils or screens, claiming mere fatigue. Some issued decrees solely by seal, avoiding direct appearance. One legendary tale speaks of a Central European ruler who addressed court through curtains, claiming divine glow, though many suspected disfigurement. In such moments, the kingdom balanced on illusion. As long as the people believed the king remained whole, law held. If not, succession crisis, legacy of fear. By the late medieval period, leprosy began to decline mysteriously across Europe. Some suggest improved housing, changes in diet, or competition with the spread of plague bacteria. Whatever the cause, lazar houses emptied. Some were converted into almshouses or abbeys, others abandoned entirely, yet the legal structures remained. The concept that disease could place a person outside society persisted. Centuries later, during outbreaks of plague, smallpox and syphilis, rulers reused the same policies. Badges of illness, quarantine zones, forced exclusion. Legal ambiguity between protection and exile, even in modern times, echoes linger. We still debate whether illness is a private condition or a matter of public control. We still design passports of health, certificates of immunity, rules for who may enter public life. The fear that guided medieval kings, that one unseen infection could unravel authority, never quite died. You, living far from torches and horsehoof echoes, remain closer to that past than you think, for even now, society asks, who is allowed among us? Who must be marked, monitored, or confined? And above all, what happens when power itself becomes vulnerable, not to rebellion, but to biology? If you made it this far, thank you for drifting through history with me. In a world full of noise, I'm grateful you chose quiet, boring sleep to unwind your mind. If this story helped you relax, or at least distracted you from tomorrow, please leave a like so more sleepy wanderers can find their way here. And if you'd like to close your eyes to more forgotten tales and quiet history, consider subscribing before you drift off. Rest well, dream softly, and I'll be waiting in the next boring chapter of the past. Good night from quiet, boring sleep.